Well, it's a great delight to introduce my good friend Michael Flaherty. Michael currently serves as the CEO of Walden Media, and if you aren't aware, the Walden Media has produced many fine films through the years. Amazing Grace, the story of Wilberforce, and the Narnia series. And I've known Mike for quite a few years now. And actually, we first engaged when the film Amazing Grace. How many of you ever saw the film Amazing Grace? See, Canadian. We were invited very early on as they were producing the film to engage with it, and that started our relationship with Michael and Walden. And since then, we've become great friends. In fact, we're such great friends this year. For Super Bowl Sunday, we were in their home in Boston, and I'm live in New York now, sort of adopted New York as my team, and it was New England against the New York Giants. And I have to say, his kids were very well behaved during the game. I'm not sure much about Michael because the Patriots actually lost, but Michael is a wonderful entrepreneur, a leader. We've worked with him with these Narnia films, and it's been a great privilege. And he's led a company that's in a very challenging industry out of Hollywood, but is a person of principle, values, bringing those things to the screen, and with a deep sense of conviction. So I was so delighted, and it was not a difficult ask. I said, "Oh, Mike, we have this conference in Vancouver. Would you like to come speak at it?" I said, "Sure, great." So we're so glad that you agreed, and I'm so glad for our friendship, Michael, and I know you're going to be inspired by what you hear from Michael Flaherty tonight. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks so much there, Jeff, and truly one of the great blessings of this job that I've had is this decade-long friendship that I've had with Jeff. And I'm from Boston, and loyalty is one of the big things in the Irish Catholic community. And Seneca once said, "Loyalty is the holiest good in the human heart." And Jeff, you have to be one of the most loyal friends a man can have. And Jewel, I can say the same for you. And thank you guys so much. It's a pleasure coming up here. Rick, thank you. What a great God-breathed vision you had for this. And just with all that's going on today, I don't know if we've ever stopped, to thank Rick and give him a round of applause. So if we could just do that right now. Thank you. It's great to be here in Vancouver because I don't know if you guys know, but we recently had an election south of the border. And what usually happens during elections is both sides, the partisans, will say if their candidate doesn't get elected, they're going to move to Canada. And so my brother Peter was one of the people running our Governor Mitt Romney's campaign for president. And so he had a long night Tuesday night, and I didn't get a chance to talk to him to let him know I'd be traveling. So the next day, I called him up to make sure he was okay, and he said, "Hey, why don't we go out and get a cup of coffee? I can talk to you." And I said, "I'd love to, Pete, but I'm in Vancouver." He goes, "Mike, don't you think that's taken it a little bit too far?" Graham Power, fantastic testimony. And what I loved hearing Graham mention was how important music was in his house growing up. And it was the same way in our house. Stories were so important. I still remember my mother giving me my first library card, and she said to me, "As long as you have this library card, you'll always have a friend." And I think that she not only knew the power of literature, but she knew the very realistic prospects for my social life. And so I appreciated that. And my dad, whose parents were from County Galway, thought that the answers to every one of life's problems could be found in the lyrics of an Irish song. And I always loved stories. We were the first house in our neighborhood to get cable television, so that was a temporary solution to my lack of friends and my over-reliance on the library card. And I always loved stories. But when I graduated from college, my dad was a lawyer, and both of my brothers were lawyers. I was the youngest of three, and I got rejected from the finest law schools in the United States, and I didn't know what I was going to do next. And so for my mom who was, an Irish Catholic, she just figured there were only two options. You could be a lawyer or you could go to the seminary. So my mother started filling out applications for me to go to seminary. And I said, Mom, I'm not ready for that. I want to see if I can do something different. And she said, what are you going to do? I said, well, I want to go to F.E.O. Schwartz and sell stuffed animals. And so I moved to New York, and I went there, and I sold stuffed animals for a while. And my father saw me on television one day wearing a purple smock with a hobby horse being ridden by a teddy bear on television for a segment they were doing on F.E.O. Schwartz. And my father called me, and he said, you know what, son, I just saw you on TV. It's time you got a job with the government and got on with your life. So I went back home, and I worked for a very colorful gentleman who was the president of the Massachusetts State Senate. His name was William Bulger. And for those of you who've heard about politics, particularly the brand that we practice in Massachusetts, you probably won't be surprised to learn that, while Bill Bulger was the president of the Senate, the most powerful position we have in Massachusetts state government, his brother was #1 on the FBI's most wanted list. Briefly replaced by Osama bin Laden, and so he took the silver medal after that. Then back up to #1 and was actually apprehended a year or so ago. Surprisingly, and I tell you completely coincidentally, down the street from our office in Los Angeles. And the one thing I learned from Bill Bulger was how important education was and how important every individual decision we make in our life was. Here was someone who was fluent in Greek, fluent in Latin, didn't drink, was a complete teetotaler, and his brother, who he shared a room with in the housing projects in South Boston, had gone in a completely different direction. So his passion was education, and I got to work on a lot of the different education legislation in Massachusetts, and from that, I got to see the almost criminal differences we have in our public school system between people who can afford a good school and people who cannot afford a good school system. So I used to volunteer on nights and on weekends with a group called the Stepping Stone Foundation in Dorchester, which is one of the lower income neighborhoods in Massachusetts. And it's hard to motivate kids, as you can guess. This was a tutoring program after school and especially on Saturday mornings. So the way that we would always break the ice was we would ask kids, what'd you do last night? And the answer was always the same. We watched television or we went to the movies. And one week I asked kids, what'd you do last night? And they said, oh, we went and saw Titanic. And the next week they said, we saw Titanic. And then the next week they said, we went to a museum to learn more about Titanic. The next week went to a library. We got books out about shipbuilding and about the history then. And so it was at that time that I realized that movies really could light the spark for kids, even if they were imprisoned in a lousy, failing school. To have them fall in love with history, to have them fall in love with literature, you could accomplish that outside of schools. At the exact same time that I was teaching at Stepping Stone, another interesting thing happened in my life that was very formative, and that was when 12 students, 2 students walked into their school in Littleton, Colorado, Columbine High School, and murdered 12 of their classmates and one of their teachers. And I went into a complete depression after that, and I couldn't make any sense of it, and I couldn't understand what had happened. And the more that I read about it, the more I realized that those 2 shooters were really poisoned by a lot of the media that they had been watching. They called that day Natural Born Killers Day after one of their favorite movies that they saw about a serial killer. They wore black trench coats because they saw a movie called The Basketball Diaries, where Leonardo DiCaprio had fantasized about donning a black trench coat and walking in and murdering his high school classmates. But I also heard stories about brave women, Cassie Bernal and Rachel Scott, and they stared down the barrel of a gun, and when they were asked, do you believe in God, they bravely looked down the barrel of that gun and said, yes, I do, and so should you. To which the shooters responded, well, then go be with him. When I heard that story, I realized I did not have the courage of a 16-year-old girl. If I was given the choice to deny God and live or proclaim him and die, I would have taken the coward's way out. I read that these girls had something called a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, so I did what all the great theologians since the Apostle Paul have done. I Googled personal relationship with Christ. And I was on my way. And so as I read about that, the Holy Spirit really took care of me and really convicted me. And I got down on my knees one night in late April of 1999, and I asked Jesus to come into my heart and to start to live my life for me so that I didn't have to make any decisions. And for anyone here who has made that decision, it really is just an incredible time. And the Holy Spirit really holds you and helps you through all of those different decisions. Of course, I had grown up in an Irish Catholic family, and I didn't know what to do next because there was nothing sacramental about this. In the Catholic Church, we have sacraments. And so I said, okay, born-again Christian, what do I do? And then I said, all right, I know what I need to do. I need to buy one of those fishes and put it in the back of my car. So I went to a Christian bookstore, and I bought the fish, and I put it in the car. I bought a couple of CDs of Christian music, and I just said, all right, this is great. I'm on my way. And the experience that I had years later would actually be mirrored in a film that we made about the great British abolitionist William Wilberforce, who also had a similar conversion experience that hit him rather quickly and made him start to think about, what is it that I am going to do with the rest of my life? And if we could just run that first clip from Amazing Grace.
Dear God, I know this is utterly absurd, but I feel I have to meet you in secret.
Sorry to interrupt, sir. There's a beggar at the kitchen door. I would turn him away, sir, but you insisted I always check.
Just give him breakfast.
Very good, sir.
Richard,
Sir?
I know that lying down on the wet grass is not a normal thing to do.
None of my business, sir.
Truth is, I've been even more strange than usual lately, haven't I? It's God. I have 10,000 engagements of state today, but I would prefer to spend the day out here getting a wet arse, studying dandelions and marveling at bloody spiders' webs.
You found God, sir?
I think he found me. If you have any idea how inconvenient that is, how idiotic it will sound. I have a political career glittering ahead of me, and in my heart I want spiders' webs.
It is a sad fate for a man to die too well known to everybody else and still unknown to himself. Francis Bacon. I don't just dust your books, sir. When I was 15, I almost ran away with the circus. They said I could have been an acrobat.
So at that time, I wasn't on my way to becoming the British Prime Minister like William Wilberforce. But, you know, as I bragged before, I could have set the record for selling stuffed animals or been the best tutor in the city of Boston. But I really felt convicted, and I had this idea that what if we made movies that were similar to Titanic? Books that could get kids excited about reading, excited about math, and excited about science. And I decided that it would be great to start a company that did such things. And now there were just two problems with my plan. The first was I had never made a movie before, and the second was I didn't know how to start a business. So my wife went out and bought me business plans for dummies, and I began to write a business plan, and I called my old roommate from college, a gentleman named Cary Granite. And Cary, at the time, was one of the most successful producers in Hollywood. But as you learn about William Wilberforce, Wilberforce had a group of people he called his co-belligerents. And those were people that might not necessarily agree with everything that Wilberforce was all about, but they agreed on this one thing, and they worked together to do it. Now, Carrie at the time was making the educational and inspirational classics, Scream, Scary Movie, Children of the Corn 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And so he might not have seemed like the most likely ally, but we got together and he said, well, Mike, you know, this is going to involve a lot of capital and we need to write a business plan. And I said, oh, Carrie, I've written millions of business plans. And I'm staring at my Business Plans for Dummies book over there. And I said, I can take care of that for you. So we put together this business plan and we went all over the country. And we got laughed out of every single private equity and venture capital shop in the country. There was one meeting actually in New York City where one of the guys actually fell asleep in the meeting, which presented a great ethical dilemma because I thought, what if we could find his checkbook and wake him up and say, oh my goodness, $100 million, thank you so much. And he'd be too embarrassed to admit that he fell asleep in the meeting. But, you know, it's one of the downsides of being a Christian. Couldn't do that. So we eventually, it was literally the last meeting that we could afford, we met with a gentleman named Phil Anschutz in Denver. And we sat down with him and we explained this plan to us. And he said, listen, I like this idea. Why don't we break and get some lunch? And when we come back, why don't you tell me about some of the movies you're going to make? And I said to myself, oh my goodness, I never thought of it that far out. You know, I just learned PowerPoint and I don't know what movies we're going to make. And so I called my wife and I said, you're not going to believe this one, but I think someone's going to finance this. And she said, you're going to be kidding me. I said, yeah, I just got to tell them what movies we're making. And she said, oh, you're kidding me. You never figured that out? And I said, no, you got to help me out. And my wife was a teacher at St. Peter's in South Boston. And so I said, tell me your reading list. And she said, okay, my reading list is Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Charlotte's Web, Bridge to Terabithia. And I said, that's fantastic. And so we got back to the meeting, and Phil said to me, all right, now, have you thought about these? And I said, well, yes. As we've been putting this business plan together, we've been holding focus groups across the country. And what we've found is that these same books keep coming up. And I mentioned those books to him, and he said, you know what? I've always loved that book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I think that would be a great movie. Let's go ahead and let's do that. And so as we went out and started to option these books, I was also reading my Bible. The first thing I did when I became a Christian was I added a signature stamp to my email with the one verse of Scripture I knew. And I realized I should probably expand a little more beyond that. And as I was reading the Bible, I realized that Jesus loved stories. Philip Yancey actually counted the number of questions that Jesus was asked in the Bible, and I think he came up with a number like 172. And Jesus only gave a direct answer to 3 of those questions. For all the other questions, you know, what should I do if I'm having trouble with my family? Let me tell you the story about the prodigal son. You know, what responsibilities do I have with my neighbor? Let me tell you the story about the Good Samaritan. And, you know, other questions like the people in Hollywood love. You know, hey, what's in it for me? And through all of those things, Jesus was always answering in parables and answering in stories. So as my spiritual life was growing, I was getting all of these incredible opportunities. And the other insight that I came up with when I was reading this was something that I had read in Paul had written in his letter to the Hebrews, where he said, the substance of faith is a hope in the unseen. And that was the common theme in all of the stories that I was reading. And it was something that, as a Christian in Hollywood, I was realizing was something I could really grapple with. And as Christian entrepreneurs in Vancouver, I'm guessing you guys have a little experience with what it's like to believe in an invisible God that you can't see and that you can't touch. People think you're crazy. And it's amazing to get good comfort from these kids in these different stories. And 2 of the movies that we made that I loved address this one head on. The first scene I'm going to show to you is a scene from Charlotte's Web, where Fern has told her parents that she is out in the barn talking to animals. And so the parents decide that they are going to seek professional help. And they go to their doctor to ask them for an opinion on what they should do about their daughter, who's clearly losing their mind.
That word. I don't think I can spell that word to the 10th grade.
Some of our berries home with you.
Think this might work?
No.
Dare I say it, he looks terrific.
Look at them all.
Yeah, smile pretty. I wish geese had teeth.
Well, what are you suggesting, that Fern has something to do with all this?
How else could those words have gotten into that web? I know everyone is saying it's some kind of miracle, but...
But what? You don't think it is?
Do you?
The web itself is a miracle. Wouldn't you agree? Well, can you spin one?
I can crochet a doily.
Because someone taught you how. Nobody teaches a spider, they just know how to spin a web. Don't you think that's a miracle?
All right, so that one got cut off a little bit. I'm going to have Jeff Tunnicliffe to come up here and act it out with me. But what is amazing about that scene is the Beau Bridges, who plays the doctor there, goes on to say, you know, there's actually a medical term for what your daughter's experiencing. It's called a childhood, and sadly, she will be cured of it. And there's plenty in Scripture about Jesus always telling us that we need to have the faith of a child, and that we need to remember that, and that we need to have courage when everyone around us is telling us that we shouldn't believe in something, that we should cling to that. And this is something that C.S. Lewis, for all of his years of denying that there was a God, he actually found himself reasoning his way into his belief in God through his mentor, Tolkien. And he had this whole idea of the trilemma, which was there are only three possibilities about Jesus. He's either a liar, he's a lunatic, or he's the Lord. And when Lewis went on to write this series of books, The Chronicles of Narnia, and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it's something he addressed directly through the character of Lucy. Now, for those of you who've seen the movie, you know that Lucy goes in through the wardrobe and comes out, and when she tells her sister and her two brothers that she's done this, they think she's crazy. And so her brother and her sister go to the professor, the house that she's living at, and ask him for his advice on what they should say to Lucy. And if you could start the Lion Witch clip, please.
You seem to have upset the delicate internal balance of my housekeeper.
We're very sorry, sir. It won't happen again.
It's our sister, sir. Lucy.
The weeping girl.
Yes, sir. She's upset.
Hence the weeping.
It's nothing. We can handle it.
Oh, I can see that.
She thinks she's found a magical land. In the upstairs wardrobe.
What did you say?
The wardrobe upstairs. Lucy thinks she's found a forest inside.
She won't stop going on about it.
What was it like?
Like talking to a lunatic.
No, not her, the forest.
You're not saying you believe her?
You don't?
But of course not. I mean, logically, it's impossible.
What do they teach in schools these days?
Edmund said they were only pretending.
And he's usually the more truthful one, is he?
No. This would be the first time.
Well, if she's not mad and she's not lying, then logically, we must assume she's telling the truth.
You're saying that we should just believe her?
She's your sister, isn't she? You're a family.
That was actually the first property that we went after, and I remember calling Douglas Gresham, who's C.S. Lewis's stepson, whose mother, Joy Gresham, had this great epistolary romance with Lewis, and then they eventually got married. And so we had convinced Douglas Gresham and the members of the C.S. Lewis estate to come to our office. And I sat down and I gave him this very passionate speech. And I said, listen, we are a company that's dedicated to making faithful adaptations of these books. And we are not going to rewrite this, and we're going to be very true to the spirit of your book. And he said, you know what, that's a really refreshing thing to hear. Well, what kind of movies have you guys made? I said, yours will be our first, but you got to trust us on this one. And so to Doug's credit, he trusted on us on that one. And, he took a flyer on it. But then once we had the movie, we had to get it made, and we had to get distribution for it. And so it was amazing. You go out, and after you option something, and I learned all this on the fly, you go out and you look for writers and you look for directors. And what was great was a couple of the rather big-time directors would come in and say, you know what, I've heard a lot about this book, and I read it, and I think it would be great. And he goes, but that whole thing about dying and coming back from the dead, I just want to get rid of that part. That's not important to the story. And so we finally found someone, as you guys know, they're called Sons of Adam and Daughters of Eve. And in another great direct sign from God, the director that we found, who was fantastic, had the last name of Adam's son. And so we knew he was the perfect guy, but we still needed to get a distributor. And so we had a meeting with the Walt Disney Company, and I had the job of making sure that the meeting went really well. I took Douglas Gresham out to lunch beforehand. We went through things, and everyone made their polite introductions. And then Douglas Gresham said, I only have one question. And everyone was sort of looking at me at the corner of their eye and saying, oh, good job. He's going to say that he really likes them. And he looked over at Dick Cook, who was the chairman of Disney at the time, and he said, why should the idolater of the great Satan come anywhere near this great Christian property? And everyone looked at me like, we gave you one job to do. And so, hey, you can't control people. And so, miraculously, we got Disney to distribute the films, and we made them, and we were well on our way. But it was always amazing to me to take that story, and also there's a great book, The Little Prince, or as they call it in Quebec, Le Petit Prince. And that is the story where the little prince meets a character named the fox. And the fox tells the little prince, it is only with the heart that you can see rightly. What is most essential in life are the things that are invisible to the eye. And that is also the way that our Lord operates. Remember the prophet Samuel telling us that man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at your heart. And as entrepreneurs, I think that you guys would love the story of David, because what it tells us is someone going about something and doing it a completely different way. David brought a slingshot to a knife fight. That had never been done before, and nobody thought that that could win. We all remember the scene where David comes down just to help out, and just as we saw with Fern with her parents, we saw with Lucy with her siblings, the first thing his brothers say to him is, what are you doing here? You should be back up there with the sheep. You're just coming down here trying to get attention. And for anyone here who has tried to go out, start a business, try to do something new, sometimes it's the people that are closest to you that can be the people that will discourage you and doubt you and try to tell you that you weren't made for this kind of work. You don't have enough experience. This is a job for other people. This is a job for bigger, more experienced people. But David didn't believe that, and he didn't get discouraged because he knew that with the Lord on his side, he could accomplish anything. And then we have that great scene where he picks up the 5 smooth stones. And when I was a kid and I heard that story, I used to wonder, well, it's not, he was kind of hedging his bets. He had 5 stones, and that kind of took the fun out of it for me. Until as I got older, I read the Bible, and I discovered that Goliath had 4 brothers. And so David's faith in the Lord was so strong, he stared down Goliath and said, when I'm done with you, I'm taking down the rest of your family, because I can do anything I can with God. And there is something really magical about that idea of doing something differently. And I think every entrepreneur here can respond to that. Malcolm Gladwell, the great writer for The New Yorker who wrote The Tipping Point and other great books, wrote an entire essay about David and the idea of underdogs. And what he found was that going through all of the history of underdogs, and they classified an underdog as anyone that was outnumbered by at least a score of 100 to 1. Believe it or not, the underdogs actually won about 30% of the time. But when the underdog decided to do things a different way, to do things in a way that no one had ever thought of before and no one ever thought possible, those odds went up to close to 70%. And that's the kind of walk of faith that you guys are taking as entrepreneurs, and also as being witnesses and having this great ministry to people in Vancouver, throughout Canada, through South Africa, and throughout the world. And the amazing part about all of this is that the Lord is using you, and also that the Lord wants you guys to make sure that people understand that it's never too late for them to reach their potential, and that God loves to work with imperfect vessels. My favorite character in all of the movies that we have made has been John Newton. We showed you that clip a little earlier of William Wilberforce, and when we first started the company, Phil had called me and said, I want to make a movie about William Wilberforce. You know who he is, don't you? And so I quickly, Google had been good to me becoming a Christian, and so I went up there and I typed in who was William Wilberforce. I said, oh yeah, of course I know him, the classic British abolitionist and statesman. He said, are you reading something off of Wikipedia? I said, all right, you caught me. And so I went home to my wife. I said, I got to learn about William Wilberforce. And the problem is all the books are, they're like 1,000 pages, and they're written by all these academics. And, I'm at a 5th grade reading level. And she said, I said, you found all the other movies. I need Dumbo's Magic Feather back. You got to tell me about Wilberforce. And so my wife went to the Christian bookstore where I bought the fish, and she found a kid's book series called Heroes of the Christian Faith. And she found me a Wilberforce book that was only 120 pages, which was perfect. And so I learned everything I needed to know about Wilberforce from there. And that's actually from that book is where we got some of the great quotes. And one quote was from William Pitt when Wilberforce was thinking of leaving Parliament and pursuing a life just solely in ministry. As William Pitt said to him, and this should be a rallying cry for all everyone here at ELO, is that Christianity leads not just to meditation, but also to action. And I also learned a lot about John Newton and what John Newton had gone through. And raise your hand here if you know the basic story of John Newton, the person who wrote the hymn of Amazing Grace. Well, it's an amazing story of God's redemptive power and how God can see potential in everyone, even the most vile of human beings. John Newton, by his own words, was an infidel, a heathen. He was a slave trader in Great Britain. And one day, as his boat was going across the Atlantic Ocean, he encountered an enormous storm. And remembering the God of his youth, he got down on his knees and he said, Father in heaven, if you can spare this ship and spare me, I will turn my life around and I will go back to you. Sure enough, the storm miraculously stopped and the boat was able to make its way into the harbor. And John Newton, thinking he was doing good on his promise, said to God, God, I'm going to turn my life around. And so, by all external appearances, John Newton turned his life around. He stopped smoking, he stopped drinking, he probably became a big fan of the punch that we have tonight, and I'm sure he even stopped dancing. But he kept trading in slaves. He did not see any inconsistency between being a Christian and being a slave owner. And at the time, that almost makes sense, because the crown and even parts of the church were trying to justify this awful crime against humanity. But in time and through prayer, God softened John Newton's heart. And John Newton started to realize that the thing that broke God's heart began to break John Newton's heart. And so he became an abolitionist, and he became a writer of hymns. And of course, his most famous is Amazing Grace. And once you know Newton's story, I once was blind, but now I see, he wasn't blind when he was a heathen. He was blind when he was a Christian. He was blind when he was a believer. And it was only through prayer and through accountability and through a group of people like this we have of believers who are constantly trying to remind us and recenter us that he was finally able to accomplish God's great purpose. And so I encourage all of you today to please not have this be the only event where you stay in touch and encourage each other and work with each other and try to witness to one another. And also not to get too nervous and too stressed out when you get back to work after we've had a great day today and you get back to all the stresses and all of the pressures that you have with your colleagues, with your family, with your investors, with your shareholders. And just remember that you live and breathe for an audience of one. And as long as you can keep that relationship solid, everything else will take care of itself. Thank you so much for having me here, and God bless you.